Hello and welcome to another Bad Cop No Donut deep dive, where today we're gonna look at the Boston Police Department. This one's gonna be good. Now usually with Bad Cop No Donut deep dives, I gotta go back 5 or 10 years, but for the Boston Police Department, I only gotta go back 1 year for most of this stuff. It shouldn't be this easy to find a police department that in just 1 year's time has a fired police chief who's a wife beater, a former president of the Boston Police Union that got busted on child rape charges, and then even if you want to make the excuse that these cops are hardworking, well, perhaps they're working a little bit too hard, because also in this year, you had 9 officers get busted for an overtime scheme. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the show, because this one's gonna be wild. I think the only way to appropriately start this video is the story of Dennis White. Dennis White's tenure as the chief of Boston Police was very short-lived. He was originally appointed by the former mayor of Boston, Martin J. Walsh, as police chief, and there were some questions about the vetting process, and you'll begin to see why there were some questions. Dennis White was essentially just waved in. His background wasn't thoroughly searched. Once again, you'll see what I mean by that. And there were things about him that other officers clearly knew because there were police reports and there were claims made for a very long time, in fact since 1999, about this man that was essentially covered up. Dennis White was sworn in as the Boston police chief on February 1st, and he is currently fired. Now why is that? Here's why. His ex-wife accused him of pushing, hitting, and threatening to shoot her, and it appeared to have happened because a judge on May 5th, 1999 issued a restraining order against Dennis White, forcing him to leave his home, surrender his service weapon, and stay away from his wife and children. And what adds more credence to this is that his ex-wife is actually another Boston police officer.
The ex-wife of the suspended Boston police commissioner telling us that the abuse she experienced at his hands was real.
Dennis White was appointed commissioner on February 1st, but suspended just 2 days later.
You see that? Does that look innocent?
What is that mark?
That's from being dragged out the door.
Dennis White's former wife, Sybil Mason, says she bears the scars of a turbulent marriage to the man trying to keep his job as head of the Boston Police Department.
What makes this weird is that just 2 days after Dennis White was sworn in as the Boston Police Commissioner, citizens began sending messages and making phone calls due to a Boston Globe report that detailed the court case in 1999. The city of Boston decided to hire a private investigator named Tansen Kaplan, and in her report found that White had, according to the court documents, threatened to shoot Sybil Mason and a friend because Dennis White thought that her and that friend was having an affair. And it doesn't stop there. In 1993, White allegedly hit and pushed a 19-year-old woman down a staircase who happened to be his own niece. So there were multiple allegations. Now the thing that I find very, very interesting is that Dennis White claimed that the former mayor of Boston, Marty Walsh, was aware of the allegations, was aware of the court case, was aware of the restraining order, and what makes that really concerning is that Marty Walsh is currently the U.S. Secretary of Labor. So a man who knowingly, according to Dennis White, allowed a wife beater to become the chief of police is now serving as Labor Secretary under the Biden administration. It doesn't matter how much you may want to defend Joe Biden or anyone in his administration, this is a nonpartisan channel and we have to be truthful here, because when it comes to Marty Walsh, there's only 2 possibilities. He either didn't look into Dennis White's background, or option 2, he knew about the background and simply covered up for Dennis White. Pick one, because those are the only real 2 options here. There was a court case, which means there were police involved because there are cops in courtrooms. There was a judge, there were witnesses, there were multiple victims over a period of years with this man, and this was public information. I mean, my question is, how in the hell did he get his service weapon back from the first domestic violence incident? You then promote this man to the highest policing position in that city. Either no one did background searches on this man, or they did the background searches, knew about it, and did nothing because Marty Walsh wanted Dennis White as police commissioner. If any of this is true, Joe Biden shouldn't walk. He should run to get rid of Marty Walsh and to see if there's any criminal charges that can be brought up against this man. But you see, Dennis White isn't the only person that I personally would like to question Marty Walsh about. There is another situation that is quite disturbing, and if you're standing, I suggest that you sit down if you haven't heard of this case. This case involves the former Boston Police Union president and Boston police officer, Patrick Rose.
And the details of the accusations he's accused of are frankly so disturbing we really can't get into them at length. What we can tell you is he's accused of indecent assault on a child between the age of 7 and 12 years old. State police arrested Rose last night in a parking lot in Needham. And what makes this possibly even more disturbing is the fact that he held leadership positions in the city. He was the president of the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association for 4 years and is a retired Boston police officer whose career spanned more than 25 years.
And now you might be thinking, what does Marty Walsh have to do with this? Well, if you were to look into the Wall Street Journal, you would see an article published asking the question, what did Labor Secretary Marty Walsh know about a union chief charged with sexually abusing children? And they're suggesting a cover-up here. But before we get into that, you gotta know more about the case. See, back during the summer of 2020, Patrick Rose was arrested on 33 counts of sexually abusing children. This man served for 24 years as a Boston police officer and was the head of the Boston Police Patrolmen's Association, or the Boston Police Union, if you will, for 3 years. And it's not as if his predatory behavior towards young children, specifically children under the age of 14, was unknown, because in 1995, he was criminally charged with sexually abusing a child and subsequently was placed on administrative duty. And then in 1996, the accuser dropped the charge because they, quote, recanted his story under pressure from Rose, end quote. The only thing worse than that is that there actually was an internal affairs investigation that same year that went nowhere. And even when the state's child welfare got involved with their investigators, they found, quote, reasonable cause to believe, end quote, that a child was being abused. In 1997, the Boston Police Union sent a letter to the Boston Police Commissioner that essentially threatened to file a grievance due to the fact that Patrick Rose was on administrative duty for 2 years. Now granted, now that we know that he's a pedophile, he not only should not have been on administrative duty, he should have been behind bars. But moving on, Patrick Rose was then reinstated despite all the evidence against him. He was given his badge back, his gun back, and he was allowed to be in contact with children. Well, the end result of that is that according to state prosecutors, Patrick Rose would go on to sexually abuse at least 5 additional minors. And what makes this even scarier is that some of these allegations came from the calendar years 2014 through 2017, which means those were the years that this man was the president of the Boston Patrolmen's Association. That would mean that the president of the Boston Police Union, who was serving in that capacity and was also a law enforcement officer, was sexually abusing children who were under the age of 14. Let that sink in for a moment. But while you're thinking about that, we gotta go back to Marty Walsh, because there are claims that this man also knew about Patrick Rose, just like there are claims that he also knew about Dennis White. Are you beginning to see a bit of a pattern here? So it's safe to say that some citizens are actually happy when Boston police are off duty, but what do they do when they're on duty? Well, to demonstrate that, we'll go back to Dennis White. You remember the wife beater? While he was on the hot seat because revelations about him were coming back to light, he actually tried to use the race card. He said that basically he's another black man being falsely accused. And I find that particularly interesting because if you want to look at this 538 article and multiple other resources, Boston is not only terrible when it comes to killing black folks, but they're one of the worst. So the only time this man is concerned about black folks being persecuted is when said black folks happen to be him. Now, we've covered several deadly sins when it comes to police brutality. There's the wife beating, there's the child molestations, there's the cover-up of the wife beating and the child molestations, there's the police brutality involving people of color, but there's another deadly sin when it comes to police, and that's stealing. Now, in this case, when it comes to the Boston Police Department, they didn't steal a physical object. Well, they kind of sort of stole money, but really what they're accused of is stealing time. If you don't know what I mean by that, well, let's roll the tape.
These 9 officers taking in a total of $200,000 in overtime they didn't work. Now, according to the indictment, the defendants were assigned to the Boston Police Department's Evidence Control Unit. 3 of the officers are still active on the force, while 6 have since retired. The U.S. Attorney's Office says the officers routinely left overtime shifts 2 or more hours early, but submitted false and fraudulent overtime slips and that their supervisors were in on it. One officer, Lieutenant Timothy Turijan, is accused of receiving more than $43,000 in overtime he didn't work. Each officer is facing a charge of conspiracy and 1 count of embezzlement.
Now, the reason why I want to make sure I mention this story is because of the response from Marty Walsh, who was the mayor of Boston at that time, but also William Gross, who was the police chief before the woman beater, Dennis White.
Boston Police Commissioner William Gross released a statement that reads in part, "News of these indictments send a strong message that this type of behavior will not be tolerated or ignored and can damage the trust my officers have worked so hard to build with the communities we serve." Mayor Walsh also saying today, these allegations are an affront to the thousands of police officers who do their jobs every day with honesty, integrity, and bravery. I am outraged and, quite frankly, outright disgusted at the utter breach of trust by these 9 individuals at the Boston Police Department.
Just think how out of touch and moronic William Gross and Marty Walsh has to be in order to think that anyone should trust the Boston Police Department at this point in time. But what do I know? I'm just a devil in the details. Thank you for watching. That was a really wild video to get through. There was a lot more information I wanted to include, but let me know what you think in the comments, guys. Is it for me, DA 1312? All cops are bastards. Phones up. Peace out.